We're laying garden beds and collecting droplets. That's right, it's Succulent from Renegade Game Studios. In this pleasantly puzzling plant placer, 2 to 4 players take on the role of gardeners, each beautifying a communal garden. By planting flower beds and optimizing their locations, players acquire resources to complete projects, many of which are worth victory points. At the end of the game, the gardener with the most victory points wins. Setup begins with garden plots. Shuffle the garden plots and deal 4 face down in a row with their long edges vertical. Then place the remaining plots along the top and bottom of that row, 2 on each, with their long edges horizontal. Flip the 2 central garden plots face up, and then form a supply of the flower beds, small, medium, and large, droplets, small and large, and cuttings, separated by type. Next, shuffle the project cards and form a face-down draw deck. Draw and reveal 5 project cards to create the project row. If you're playing with 4 players, you're going to draw 6 project cards. Each player then receives 1 greenhouse dealt at random. They then choose a color and take the corresponding gardener piece and flowers. The number of flowers depends on the player count. 14 flowers each for 2 players, 12 for 3 players, and 10 for 4 players. They were also going to take 1 small and 1 medium flower bed, placing them next to their greenhouse. The player whose greenhouse has the earliest letter of the alphabet will take the first turn, and continuing with the next player clockwise. Gameplay occurs in turns, each divided into 2 steps: perform an action and, optionally, complete a project. First up in the perform an action step, the active player chooses from 2 action options. They may either place a flower bed or gain flower beds. The first option, place a flower bed, allows the player to take 1 flower bed from their personal inventory and place it in the garden over empty spaces on 1 or more face-up garden plots. Some rules for placement. Flower beds cannot overlap with other flower beds. Duh. They can't cover spaces on face-down garden plots, and they can't overhang an edge. To indicate ownership, the active player also places 1 of their flowers from their supply in the round hole of their flower bed. For each space covered with this action, the player gains a cutting of that type from the supply. If any of the spaces have a droplet symbol as well, the active player gains 1 small droplet from the supply and adds it to their greenhouse. More on what those droplets do shortly. Additionally, if a player covers the last droplet icon currently visible in the entire garden, a new garden plot is revealed. The active player chooses 1 of the face-down garden plots to now be placed face-up. They then, as a bonus, may immediately place a small flower bed from their inventory onto a space anywhere in the garden. It doesn't have to be on the newly revealed plot. But if they don't have a garden bed, they can't place it. Also, if any players, including the active player, have a flower orthogonally adjacent to the newly placed bed, they gain 1 small droplet for each such flower. Those droplets must be immediately placed in their greenhouse. The second action option, gain flower beds, allows the active player to take their cute little gardener from its current position and place it on the bottom right corner of an unoccupied project card in the project row. They then immediately gain the flower beds listed from the supply and place them in their inventory. Once a player has completed step 1 by either placing a flower bed or gaining flower beds, their turn moves to the optional complete a project step. Let's look at the project cards. Each is probably going to have a completion cost in cuttings, point value for end-game victory points, an immediate bonus, gardener space, and flower beds. During this step, the player may choose to complete 1 project, paying the completion cost back to the supply. They then take that project card into their supply, gaining any immediate bonuses. Also, if a gardener is on the gardener space of the purchased project card, it's returned to its owner, and that player gains 1 large droplet, even if it's the active player. After the card is acquired, the player's turn is over and the next turn begins. One little note, a player can only ever hold a maximum of 6 garden beds and 10 cuttings at the end of their turn. If they exceed that, they must return those extra ones into the supply until they meet the limit. Turns continue with players laying beds, gaining beds, earning cuttings, and completing projects. Let's talk about droplets and greenhouses. When a player acquires a droplet, they may place it on any empty space in any section of their greenhouse. Once a section is full of droplets, they can be spent as one cutting of that section's type. This helps players pay for projects they couldn't otherwise afford without the droplets. When paying in this way, they will remove all the small droplets from that section, returning them to the supply. Large droplets, however, stay in place. Droplets cannot be transferred between sections, but they can be moved onto different spaces within their own section. Additionally, 9 of the droplet spaces have victory point values. These will only be gained for a player in the end game if they have a large droplet on that space. The end game is triggered once a player has placed their last flower, or if the completed project's limit is reached. That's 8 projects in a 2-player game, 7 for 3 players, and 6 projects for 4 players. Once one of these conditions occurs, players complete the round, then players play one more round, each taking another turn. After that, points are tallied for project cards, scoring spaces in their greenhouse with large droplets on them, and a half a point for each remaining resource. This is cuttings, small droplets, and flower beds. The player with the most points wins the game. In the case of a tie, the player with the most flowers in the garden wins. And that's the basics of Succulent. I'm Becca Scott, this is Good Time Society, and you love plants, so you probably love us, so you should hit the like and the subscribe button over there, and come on back for more great games and good times. We'll see you later.